Hi, and welcome to part 2 of my look at the question, is the universe conscious? In part 1, we looked at why this very old idea of panpsychism, or the idea that consciousness is in some way present in all things, or is in the very nature of the universe itself, has gained new interest in recent years. Today, I want to look at some of the arguments for this point of view, and to try to understand different ways of looking at the question. Should I even mention that much of this material is highly speculative? I guess I should, so I did. First, I want to get a little clearer than perhaps I was in the last video about how we get from questions about consciousness themselves to questions about the possible consciousness of the universe. We touched on the difficulties of a strictly material view of consciousness, and the difficulty in the assumption that somehow the functioning of the human brain leads to consciousness as an emergent property. I say we touched on this difficulty because there's a long and complex dialogue that has gone on in the philosophy of mind and the intersecting disciplines of neuroscience and computer science. This area of thought runs at least from Leibniz to the Turing test, and I've linked to an excellent piece on Searle's Chinese room argument in the description if you're interested. This video is not intended to deal directly with this important area of inquiry, but accepting the difficulty of viewing consciousness as the result of the mere functioning of the brain opens the door to the question of where consciousness actually resides, or if you prefer language that doesn't imply a physical locality to consciousness, then we might say opens the door to the question of the nature of consciousness and the conditions that make it possible. If we have doubt that consciousness is adequately explained through the functioning of the brain, then we must look elsewhere for the origin of consciousness. Is it a biological phenomenon? How exactly would biological tissue be different from other materials that function similarly? And if we have legitimate questions about that, and about whether other entities like AIs are conscious, where else can we look? Maybe we need to broaden our ideas about the nature and source of consciousness. We might look to the broadest possible source and origin of consciousness, that in some way consciousness is present in the universe itself. Of course, you don't need modern computer science to cast doubt on the brain as the source of consciousness, as panpsychism has been an influential position for thousands of years. I think there are two main approaches to the idea that the universe might be conscious. You might call these a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach rejects emergent properties. In this view, nothing new comes from putting elements like neurons or computer chips together. Instead, consciousness resides in every piece of matter. The idea is that nature doesn't create entirely new properties when simpler things are put together to make complex things. The properties of complex things are more complex, but simpler forms of those complex properties reside in the simpler elements. This doesn't mean that an atom has the experience of feeling emotions or of hearing trumpet music. Each tiny element of matter has its own tiny bit of consciousness, perhaps unimaginably small. When these particles are brought together, they add up to a more complex form of consciousness, which would include human consciousness and human subjective experience. In other words, the properties of these complex systems, including properties like consciousness, are present in some measure in the smallest components of those systems. In this view, the entire universe and everything in it possess consciousness in varying proportions depending on the assembly of its minimally conscious parts. The most influential of the recent top-down approaches may be integrated information theory. This idea was first laid out by Guilio Tononi in 2004 and further elaborated by people like David Chalmers and Christoph Koch. Tononi's approach was to look at all things we know have consciousness and to find what properties they possess. When you do this, he argues, you see that all things that have consciousness collect, assemble, and integrate information. In this view, complex things may indeed have properties that simpler ones lack. If this is correct, then brains are exactly the kinds of things that have consciousness. Human brains, but also animal brains and even earthworm brains collect, assemble, and integrate information. What about thermostats? They collect information and do something with it. Koch argues no, informational systems need to possess a causal power and a capacity for integrating information that in thermostats is negligible. So no, thermostats are not conscious in his view. On a larger scale, the universe itself integrates an unfathomable amount of information about reactions, interactions, particles, and the like. Some will take this insight and argue that the universe is the ultimate information processing machine. The conscious whole, that is, the universe itself, gives rise to all its less complex parts, leading to the idea that the entire universe is conscious, and that complex enough information processors within the universe themselves possess forms of consciousness. The consciousness of the universe is not viewed as a kind of human consciousness. It may not be assembled in such a way as to produce rational thought. But this idea expands the limits of how we might think about consciousness, and does seem to have possible implications for other information integrating systems like AIs. So are these ideas correct? Is the universe conscious in ways suggested here? I don't know. I think we are just in the earliest stages of elaborating these ideas and observing how they apply to what we observe, to AIs, and to the universe. Right now they are intellectual and philosophical solutions to very difficult problems. Some would say they are stabs at solutions to an impossible problem, that the hard problem of consciousness may forever be too hard for beings such as ourselves to solve. After all, as is sometimes argued, is it really possible for the human brain to fully understand itself? Is there a logical fallacy in our attempting to do so, in trying to understand ourselves, our brains, and our consciousness? Is there a logical fallacy in setting up the problem that way? What do we really mean by understanding ourselves or understanding consciousness? Chalmers is often cited as quoting his colleague, the philosopher John Perry, as saying, "If you think about consciousness long enough, you either become a panpsychist or you go into administration," which is sobering because I don't like administration. I await further developments and new ideas from future Einsteins and Newtons, and for that matter, Leibniz's and Buddhas, in trying to solve this. In the meantime, I have another idea about whether the universe is conscious. One that doesn't answer the question of whether the universe is conscious as a whole. To me, the universe is certainly conscious in a sense. If we human beings are conscious, and we are part of the universe, then the universe consists at least in part of conscious beings. It seems to me that the universe must be at least as conscious as its component elements are conscious. We are aware of the universe, at least in our human way of being aware, and we reflect with awe on it and on its nature. So the universe, through us, reflects on itself. Each of us is part of a process of the universe becoming aware of itself. Be sure to subscribe. You can follow my Instagram, and thanks a lot for watching.